Hi, this is Nikita Petrov coming to you from St. Petersburg, Russia. The conversation you're about to hear is between me and John Horgan, who is a friend of mine, a science journalist, and a writer. His latest book, I think, is in the final stages of preparation for publishing. It's going to feature my illustrations, which I'm happy about. It's called Pay Attention, and is a kind of a departure from the kind of writing he had been doing before. This thing is like a stream of consciousness kind of reporting on what's going on inside of his head. I really liked it. It's a really good book. We'll talk about it at some point in the future before it's published. In this conversation, we start off talking about the political upheaval in the US and the opposite of an upheaval, I suppose, here in Russia, because we seem to be turning Putin into a kind of a monarch. Today is the last day of this voting on the constitutional changes that will allow him to stay in power for 16 more years. We start talking about politics. At some point, the conversation drifts, as it tends to, between John and I, into these questions of like, what is the fundamental nature of reality, whether it's all a dream or a simulation, and if it's some kind of an interactive experience that ends and allows you to reflect on it afterwards, what is your interpretation of it going to be, and whether it's going to be much different or close to the same of the interpretation of somebody like Donald Trump or just other people in the world. So it's a kind of a wide-ranging conversation, but politics and power, I guess, are the main topics. Now, if you like this conversation or this show in general, you might want to go to psychopolitica.com, see if you like what you see there, and subscribe if you do. That's my newsletter. Right now, it's just my writing, my drawings. But I think we're going to run something by John, an interview by John there sometime soon. And well, we'll see. It changes, it evolves. Right now, it comes out once a month. I hope to make it more frequent and broader. Well, it's pretty broad right now, but I hope to make it not just my own content sometime soon. So that's psychopolitica.com. And in about 10 seconds, you will see a very cute little dog. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
I'm gonna show you a dog.
Oh, wow. That's a Russian dog?
I mean, he's in Russia. He was born in Russia. I think that makes you Russian. Yeah. I mean, the breed is. I don't really know. The word is Spitz. I don't know how you say it in English. What the name is in English, but it's apparently a descendant of a swamp dog. There was once a dog that used to live in a swamp, and now, some thousands years later, we have this. All right. So, what is the hat about?
Okay, so let's see. 3.5 years ago, this old friend of mine convinced me to go to Donald Trump's inauguration in Washington.
Hmm.
We were going to meet up with some groups protesting Trump's ascent, and also we were planning to stay for the Women's March. Anyway, my friend came with these. I think these are supposed to be Pussy Riot hats.
I think those are not connected. I think it's just a pussy hat.
Oh, Pussy hat. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so my friend Robert, he brought this hat for me, and so I wore it the entire time I was down there when I was marching with anarchists and hard left young people, Antifa, people like that. We ended up with a group of people who turned violent and were fighting with the police and smashing windows. And it was kind of scary. We got sort of swept up in it. So I've kept this this hat to remind me of that period. And it's possible I might have to go to Washington again in 6 months or whatever to protest Trump's inauguration once again. And so I'm not sure exactly what you wanted to talk about today, but I thought you wanted to talk about, among other things, politics in our different countries, and also the sort of general principle of power and how power is related to reality. And I thought wearing this hat would put me in the mood for that.
That's right. So, well, what you just said is related to some of the things I've been thinking. So, in Russia and in America, these political realities are very different. There are similarities somehow, but lately I've been talking to my friends over here. So the two things happen in America, you know what's happening. Everything is happening. Everybody's fighting everybody, and I don't understand all of it. It you need to like really be on top of it to just even catch up with the reality of the day. I think the last thing that I've heard that oftentimes nowadays I hear a thing about here's another thing that's happening in America, and I need to take a pause and figure out what is that. The last of one of those was the fireworks. Have you heard about the fireworks?
Oh, yeah.
Are you hearing the fireworks?
I first became aware of it. You know, I live in this high rise in Hoboken, right on the river, and it's kind of nice. It's very bourgeois, and I was, I think I'd actually gone to sleep already, and suddenly I hear all this noise, and it sounded like a gunfight. And I thought, oh shit, stuff is really getting real now. And so I went and looked out my sliding glass doors, and there, right on the river, I can look out my living room and see the Hudson River. There are all these fireworks exploding. I mean, serious fireworks. And it went on for a long time. Then the next day, I found out that this is a huge thing. It's been going on in New York for a while and other cities across the United States. And it's not clear how it's related to all the protests, or whether it's just kind of natural exuberance. Of some young people, primarily young men. There are already, as you probably know, conspiracy theories.
That's the only theory that I've heard so far is a conspiracy one about like the police setting the fireworks off to let people, like you thought, oh, shit's getting real. And maybe it would put you in the mood of maybe I want some police presence in the street because things are exploding.
That's exactly right. You know, what was funny was the conspiracy theories got so much, were circulated so widely that the police chief of Hoboken went on this, I get this newsletter from the mayor. And so a day or two after I heard the fireworks, and they continued for a couple of nights, I got there was a notice from the police chief basically saying, hey, listen, we're not setting off the goddamn fire. He didn't say goddamn. He said, we're not doing this. I know some of you think that, but you just got to trust me. It's not us. It seems to be just some young people who are letting off steam, and it bothers a lot of people who can't sleep. So we're going to start cracking down on it, okay?
That still kind of plays into the conspiracy theory almost, if they do put an end to the fireworks.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about conspiracy theories. Yeah. You can't disprove them. And one interesting fact about the fireworks is that because these are big fireworks. I happen to know because I've bought fireworks in the past, that these big ones that shoot up a couple 100 feet and blow up with streamers, they're expensive. It can cost $75, $100 for one of these big rockets. And in New York, I have friends who say that these fireworks are going off for 5 or 6 hours all night.
That reminds me,
So,
I've heard another conspiracy theory on that. And that is that China, which produces most of the fireworks of the world, has flooded the American market, and that naturally made more people buy fireworks because they're cheap and just play with them. And then that has all the, consequences.
oh, that's great. I actually hadn't heard that one. But did China do this maliciously, or are they just trying to make a buck?
Well, so my only connection to that theory is a thread on Twitter that I read once. I think the intention there was that China is doing this maliciously. Yes, I actually should send you a link to the guy on whose Twitter feed I saw this, because he's an interesting, weird character. He's like an artist who has like a history with psychedelics and different kinds of esoteric and occult thought, and then ended up like a Christian traditionalist kind of guy. So he creates art that looks very contemporary, and you could even apply the word psychedelic to describe the kind of vibe of it. But then his positions, and he's very versed in all of this weird stuff, but then his actual position is this like traditional Christian. He said something that resonated with me. He says, commenting on all the protests and all of this stuff, he said, everybody's talking about late stage capitalism. We really should be talking about late stage Hollywood, because a lot of what we're seeing is people, behaving politically after years and years of imagery coming into their heads from the movies, from the internet. They know that if you do something that stands out, that's probably going to be filmed, probably going to end up on the internet. Everything is a gesture. Everything is it becomes this like a never-ending movie online. And so people act the way they know you should act in the movie, right? And fireworks and explosions and the breaking of the windows, and that's definitely one of my perceptions. Like us here in Russia, looking at news from America, very quickly you get like overwhelmed, and you stop. Even it's hard to like keep track of the political narrative of it, but what you really do get from all of this is like this is a very American thing that's happening there. Like everybody is a character. Everybody there are groups of people, not just fighting, but fighting in this very performative kind of way, and everybody's involved, and there's so much of this happening, and at some point everybody has their own like breaking point where you go, I don't understand anymore, but it's still very engaging.
Yeah, of course, in times like this, especially, I assume everybody does this, but probably the older you are, the more you do it. You're looking for historical analogies,
Right.
and a lot of people are saying, and I'm certainly feeling it myself, that this is like the late 60s in the United States, when there were a lot of people on the street,
Mm-hmm.
when there was, it was the Vietnam War, it was civil rights, there was the whole hippie culture, it was psychedelics, it was raging against the machine. And there was a definite performative aspect to that. Also, you had some of these counterculture maestros like Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman, who were organizing the protests at the Democratic Convention in 1968, and had very much an eye toward the kind of drama that would help get them media coverage.
Right.
And so what's going on now resembles that. And I have to say that the emotional reaction to what I'm having now it reminds me of how I felt late 60s, early 70s, when I was still a teenager, but part of me was kind of frightened.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, the world is spinning out of control. who knows what's going to happen. But I was really exhilarated and excited. I wanted to see what would happen next. There was a kind of nihilistic part of me that
Right.
just thought, this is fucking great. Who knows where this is going to lead? But this is an exciting movie. I'm into it. But then there was also this moral sort of priggish part of me that thought, no, this is good. We're evolving toward a better world. So I had all these kind of conflicting feelings, and I feel very much like that. I'm having all these flashbacks to that period now. Right now, I'm in a place where it seems really good. I'm thinking that everything is sort of possible right now, including some very radical changes in American government for the better. But we'll see. A lot of us thought that way in 1968. There was this paradox that after Martin Luther King was assassinated, there were riots in some major cities across the U.S., and that helped lead to a civil rights advance, I think it was called the Fair Housing Act. So that was a definite advance. And Lyndon Johnson was kind of freaked out by the riots, and he helped push that through. But there was evidence that it also led to a backlash that helped to get Richard Nixon elected.
Right.
Right.
And
So
Trump is using some of Nixonian language, right? The silent majority.
Yeah. So it's not clear to me. I mean, I think that is the big question in American politics right now, is whether all the protests, all this kind of social ferment is going to take us in a progressive direction in some kind of an enduring way, or is just going to provoke a big backlash that gives us 4 more years of Trump and Republican control.
You mentioned some names just now of people who you maybe could call leaders, or at least organizers, right? At that time, one of the things that I hear from Americans is the difference now is you have a mass something. It's not even clear whether you can call it a movement, because it's moving in different directions, sometimes in opposing directions. But there's not a group of people that you can talk to, that can represent the movement, that can be negotiated with, that can give you a list of demands or anything of that sort. Is that true? Do you see that difference or not?
Yeah, I think so. Well, when you've got a counterculture, if you're talking about anarchists, and I know, when I was in Washington, I was marching side by side with a lot of people who identified themselves as anarchists, which is kind of funny. They had anarchist flags and pennants. And of course, the idea of an anarchist leader is an oxymoron, right? And so the counterculture has always had this paradox of being anti-authoritarian to the point where, shit doesn't get done. Right? You need to have some kind of structure and leadership if you want to change things in an enduring way politically. At least, so in the 1960s, we had some political candidates who were pretty exciting for progressives, like Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, but who ended up being assassinated. You could ask whether he really was progressive, but certainly compared to today, he was. And then we ended up with Hubert Humphrey, who was Hubert Humphrey might be sort of like Joe Biden, except not senile. That's probably a little harsh, but yeah, as far as leadership goes, the kind of leadership we need to actually lead to changes, or even something that's the equivalent of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, who was listening to Martin Luther King and doing things to try to appease Martin Luther King. I don't know what we have that's like that. Joe Biden, I really wish we had a better candidate, or even a third party candidate who was more exciting, except of course that would probably mean that Donald Trump would get reelected. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yeah, the leadership question, it was a big question back in the 60s, and it's a question today for the progressive, for all the people who want serious radical change.
Yeah. The reason I ask is you sound optimistic. Part of the reason I'm not so optimistic is just I don't understand anymore what exactly is happening. There's like fireworks is an example. The fireworks, by the way, another thing to mention about the fireworks, the other piece of online content that I've seen that's connected to fireworks is a group of people like shooting a guy using fireworks. There's like I don't remember exactly. I think that there's like a driver who got out of his car who was either white or Asian, and then a group of black people who had fireworks that they held in their hands and targeted at him, and so he was crouching. And so with fireworks, my feeling is it's almost like the way memes spread online. There's like an image that somehow gets people's attention, and then that image morphs and changes, and everybody uses it in different way, in their own way, and to advance sometimes political agendas and so forth. And so with fireworks, it feels like that. Like somebody started setting off fireworks, and then you can imagine all of the conspiracy theories, whichever you come up with, to be true. Maybe a cop or a group of cops did that for their reasons, and then a street gang used it as a weapon, and then progressive people used it to express their feelings about the situation. But what you end up with is just a little, like a degree higher of chaos or of shit's happening.
Yeah, I tend to look for the sort of dumbest default explanation,
Right.
and in this case, it would be just that there are a lot of young people, and I what I've been told, what I've read online, is that the people setting off the fireworks primarily are young men of color, that they're just like really restless. They've been cooped up because of the pandemic. And then there's also the protests in the street. And so this is it's just a way of letting off steam. In a larger sense, I sort of feel like, what's going to happen next? I mean, we've had this series of things happen in the United States that I'd say were maybe not entirely unpredictable, but still pretty surprising, where you sort of go back, if you go back just 4 months, who would have thought we'd be in this lockdown from the virus? Go back 2 months, who would have thought that there would be millions of people marching because the police killed a black man in Minneapolis? And then who would have thought that this weird fireworks thing was going to happen?
Right.
So what's next? I feel like the world is just becoming the world is always strange, but I feel like it's becoming stranger and more unpredictable now. And that the election hasn't even really started happening yet. I mean, what's going to happen when, within the next couple of months, I guess we're going to have the conventions for the Republicans and the Democrats. I'm sure there's going to be some craziness associated with that. Where are the protests going to go? Are we actually going to have police departments defunded? I just wrote a piece for Scientific American. It hasn't been posted yet. I hope it will be soon, calling for defunding of the military. And I know there are a lot of people who are talking about that. And I think Bob even has written something about that. Bob Wright, the master of...
He's the one who told me about the fireworks.
Yeah. And so are we actually at the point where people will say, yeah, let's get rid of the fucking military industrial complex once and for all. We've been talking about it forever. Let's do it. And, capitalism is out of control. Let's do something about capitalism. Let's really shake things up.
Well, I'm sure that some people will say that, and some people are saying it now, but I'm skeptical about like a consensus emerging.
Yeah, especially since, I mean, what's the alternative? That the Russia and like China is like its economy is capitalist at this point. It's this
Right.
kind of weird controlled capitalism. So and capitalism has a way of just kind of eating its critics.
Hmm.
Uh,
Turning them into things to sell.
Pardon me?
Turning the criticism into a thing that's gonna sell to the people who aren't happy with capitalism.
That's right. Yeah. So I don't know. And like I said, this feeling of unpredictability makes me a little frightened. I'm like a bourgeois professor, lives in a high rise, and has money invested in the stock market. So do I want total chaos and anarchy and revolution? No, I don't, for personal reasons, but also for what I hope are rational reasons. I look at history, and in general, when I see revolution, it tends to be followed by bad things.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me, there's this anecdote about the great revolutionary poet in Russia, Mayakovsky, Vladimir Mayakovsky. He has this poem called "Хорошо," means good, and that expresses his feelings basically about the revolution. And I think, if I remember this correctly, the title of the poem comes from an exchange he had with a different kind of poet, with like a Silver Age, much more refined type of guy. And the exchange was Mayakovsky talking about all the upheaval going on around, said, "Хорошо." He liked it. It's good. And then Bloch said, "They burned my library down." And that was the difference between these two people and the way they felt about the social change. And the revolution, I haven't thought about like the possibility of like a revolution type revolution here where I am, because we're taping this on June 30th. Tomorrow is the end of the voting on the constitutional changes that will let Putin stay in power for 16 more years.
16 more years. Wait a minute. How old is Putin now?
He's 60 something. Let me look it up. People ask me that, and I keep forgetting how old he is.
Well, so he wants to be president into his 80s?
Let's see. He's 67. Yeah. So he's going to be able to run two more times, 6 years each, and the next election is 2024.
Wow.
And the way it's written down, it's like it's specifically for him that they're making the change, meaning one change they're making in the Constitution is right now, something that Putin has used before is there's ambiguity in the language. It says that one person cannot be president 2 times in a row. And the assumption before Putin was that means 2 terms. But he said, no, there's this in a row thing. And so there was this time when Medvedev was president for a little while, and then Putin came back for 2 more terms because that's not in a row anymore. So that's fine. So one change they're making in the Constitution is they're getting rid of this in a row thing. So on the face of it, there's more limits to the presidential power. One person cannot be president more than 2 times, period. Except if you're Putin. Except if this, because the Constitution is being, these changes are being made now. He's the president now, and all that's in the past doesn't count anymore. So for him, everything starts anew next time he wants to run. So I haven't thought about revolution because I'm not feeling it. I'm not seeing any like radical changes coming. But a revolution has crossed my mind recently because for the first time in my life, I started thinking about the possibility of buying land and having a house, and that like I've never had anything, any kind of property like that, not an apartment, not any, not anything that substantial. And I think part of the reason I never even aspired to have anything of that sort is because I grew up in the 90s, and uh, I just like it didn't even have to be like conscious thought processes. Just like with my upbringing, I internalized the idea that whatever you want to hold on to may be taken away, because that's how it goes. And so now with this thought of, hey, maybe I can buy some land and build a house, and it'll be my, and I can start a family there, and even my children would have that land. And at that point, you have to stop yourself and remind yourself you're in Russia. That kind of planning is not coherent with the history of the country. You can't be sure that something's going to continue for a generation or two, because something may happen and things will be redistributed in a maybe bloody way.
So you're thinking about having children? You're not married, are you?
Not married, but I am in a relationship that seems to be evolving quickly.
And you are okay. So this is a really serious issue. It's sort of this in a way is where, I don't know, radical politics and personal self-interest intersect. You might sort of intellectually and for moral reasons want certain outcomes for your society, but then it's hard not to think, well, is this going to affect me, and how's it going to affect what I own, and how will it affect my children? So having kids really turned me. I'm still pretty far left, but having children made me more of a real bourgeois conservative.
Right.
And right now, I have to say that, as crazy as things have gotten in the United States, I think you always can take for granted, at least since maybe the 1960s, that the overall political order is stable, right? And the economy is stable. There are ups and downs, but you don't have to worry about things falling apart. Well, I don't know. Right now, this is maybe how you guys in Russia feel all the time. Right now, I feel like you can't take anything for granted in the United States.
Right.
There's a possibility of, at the very least, really severe economic collapse.
Right.
If this virus just doesn't go away, and plus maybe political changes that push us far away from our from our current form of capitalism. And so I'm sort of, I want some of these things to happen, but self-interest makes me a little bit worried about them too. Hey, I wanted to, there's one set of, you sent me an email with some ideas you'd been thinking about recently. And one thing I wanted to get into, which I think you were talking about in that email, was the idea of, well, this is how I interpreted it, power as a kind of organizing principle of reality.
Well, let me tell you what this has been the topic of a few conversations lately for me. And it's directly related to understanding these two things that are happening in parallel in America and in Russia. In Russia, we have Putin morphing into this czar, and in America, you have that, whatever you have there, this chaos, this upheaval. And I thought that here's one way to look at the reason Putin is in power and Trump is in power. That there are some ideas in each of these two cultures, American and Russian, about what power is, how you decide that somebody has power. Sort of like in the gospel, they talk about Jesus, because there are people who say he spoke as if he has power. He spoke as if he has authority. Who is this person? Similarly, here's a good example of this. In the 90s in Russia, when the previous system collapsed and the criminal syndicates started to run things, at a certain point, there was no formal authority, right? If there's a dispute between like a small business owner and one group of criminals who want money from him and another group of criminals who want money from him, and maybe the cops who are basically the same kind of entity, who's gonna figure out what's gonna happen? Well, the kind of person that would be listened to was called authoritet, authority, an authority figure, a person who has authority. It's a specifically, like, it's a word that doesn't exist anymore of in that meaning. Like you don't call a person authoritet in Russia anymore. It was a specific kind of guy, and that was basically what the word means. It was just the guy that is listened to in these kinds of situations, right? He doesn't have a position, or maybe he has some position somewhere. He might belong to one group or the other, but what's known about him is that's the person you're going to listen to in this kind of dispute.
Because he has just sheer power, or because he also has moral authority?
I think there are many different kinds of people who existed like that. It's usually criminal, but it's a criminal who somehow gained that status, right? There are many different kinds of criminals, and not everybody is treated with respect.
Right.
Not anybody is gonna be somebody who people listen to, especially when the people in question are criminals themselves, and the struggle for power, struggle for authority is what they engage in. And moreover, the lifespan of such a person might not be very long. You are this authority for a little while until somebody with a bigger gun or more courage or whatever it takes, to topple that person appears. But my point is just that there is an understanding of, a person walks into a room and there's a feeling that people get whether that person is going to be listened to or not. And so the different cultures, America and Russia, have, I think, different set of ideas or images or memes about power, about what power is, and what do we see, how do we decide whether somebody has power or not. And I think Putin matches many of the ideas. First off, I think there's more of a consensus on that issue in Russia than in America, of what power is and how it looks. And then I think Putin, one of the defining qualities of Putin is we don't know who he is. We don't know much about his private life.
Really?
His daughters sometimes are referred to as like this woman who is rumored to be his daughter, right? He's quite secretive about his private life. And then there is this mythology to him. He's a KGB agent. A KGB agent is the kind of guy who you never are sure what he's thinking of because he's playing a spy game with you. And so he, over time, the most beautiful, my favorite expression of this fact that we don't know much about Putin, the man, is there's this idea that is present in what I call like the political mythology, meaning you just hear a version of it every once in a while from a guy in the bar, from a taxi driver, from somebody else. And this is the idea that Putin does not exist at all. There's like versions of it include there used to be a real Putin, but he was like assassinated at some point and a double took over. Or he's always been a team of lookalikes, or he's a group of androids, or he's mass hallucination. Just a variety, a CGI model, variety of ideas that can be interpreted in different ways. But one way to interpret them is we just don't know who this person is, but maybe one way to say is he's the image of power. He is this like vision that we all have of who's in charge.
That image is, it sort of reflects the sense that people have of him being almost superhuman and incredibly competent at wielding power and maintaining power?
It depends. It depends. You can. I think that the idea, this meme that Putin does not exist. Well, most of the time people say it as a joke. That makes some sort of a comment on our situation. B, sometimes you do meet crazy people who think in it, that it is the literal truth. And then the layers of interpretation to it can be different. Some people see him as evil, some and incompetent. Some people, and to some, it's an expression of you shouldn't be focusing on Putin. He's just a guy who we project things on, but it's the system around him and the history of the country and all the trends that are happening in the society that make him do the things that he does. Maybe he's not even in control. There are all of these various interpretations of the idea. But this is kind of tangential. What I was trying to get at is my recent thought, that the reason Putin stays in power is he played and he's continuing to play with a lot of different images for himself, and like the vocabulary he uses is of certain kind. And I think he's good at kind of checking these boxes of what a person who has power is supposed to look like or sound like. He's kind of this monarch figure. At the same time, he talks like a manager sometimes, like he's here to just do the technical thing. He is the president. He is a KGB agent. He uses criminal lingo sometimes that make him sound like that kind of person from the 90s, like he knows the rough reality of the criminal kind of world. He's also a lawman, right? He sometimes pretends to be a lawyer of some kind and make these references to there's this one montage of him saying it should be within the limits of the law. He just keeps repeating this phrase over years. You can find it like a million instances. Whatever they ask him, should the people be able to protest in the streets? And he goes, of course, but it has to stay within the limits of the law. And everything, just any question, he does this caveat about the limits of the law, and nobody knows what he means exactly. But the reality is you don't really get to protest in the streets a whole lot. But in any case, so he is, I think, good at maintaining the sound and feel and look of a person who has power according to this kind of Russian, maybe unarticulated idea. And even if you don't like him, especially, I think, many people who really don't like him think he's very powerful. That's the problem that they have with him. But overall, there is not an argument about whether he has power or not. Everybody's convinced of that.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's largely done through this, like, the game that he plays with the imagery, with how he talks, with how he sounds. And then in America, what I see, and you tell me if that's right or not, I think there's not a consensus about anything right now. And Trump is, I feel like maybe he matches, like there are people on the radical left who not only think that Trump is a horrible person and shouldn't be in power, but they have a problem with the idea of power itself. They don't like authority generally. They don't like systems generally. They think that, cops shouldn't have the power. They have the professors in the university shouldn't have the power they have. The student body should be able to overthrow them and rule. And so there's this anti-order, anti-power notion on the extreme left. And to them, Trump matches that view, like all power is corrupt and horrible and racist, and Trump is corrupt and horrible and racist. And then on, let's say, the other end of the spectrum, you have people who have really internalized the values of this rough capitalism that exists in America. And they think whatever it takes to make it, if you made it, you made it. Everything is fair in competition. And so long as you and up on top, you're the guy, and to them, Trump is that. And so the idea is that both Putin and Trump, part of the reason they continue to be in power, we'll see what happens with Trump. I don't have any doubts about the very recent future of Putin. But part of the reason they stay in power is because the image that they project, the way we see them, different kinds of people see them, matches ideas of power that we have.
Yeah, so I would, if I may just sort of riff on this, one of the things when I saw your discussion of power in this email that you sent me before this conversation, I was thinking of something more kind of metaphysical.
Okay.
And related to what are we doing here? What's the purpose of life? And it seems to me that this can be reduced to what makes life meaningful for us as individuals or collectively. And I'm this kind of nerdy intellectual type. And so for me, the meaning of life comes down to trying to figure things out, trying to understand the world, and sort of watching the world and making observations, and then trying to find patterns. And so it's in the tradition of science and philosophy, or even theology. But there are other big meanings of life out there that attract other people. One would be trying to make the world a better place, having a kind of moral program. And I share that to a certain extent as well. That, a big one is we're here to love each other. This is related to the moral program. And so to love and be loved, that's a kind of Christian principle. But it seems to me that the enduring, or certainly an enduring, a big principle for a lot of people is that life is a game, a competition with winners and losers. And that it's all about winning the game, which comes down to accumulating as much power as possible. In other words, we're all trying to manipulate each other. And some people are better at manipulating others. And, they become president, or they become the czar of Russia, or they become the head of a religious cult, or a head of a prestigious philosophy department, because even within the intellectual traditions and religion and so forth, there are also these hierarchies where people are jockeying for power. I started thinking about this when, I first started thinking about artificial intelligence and the possibility that we were going to create machines that were going to take over from us. And what I realized, reading a lot of the literature on the singularity and the coming ascendance of machines, is that a lot of visionaries just assumed that machines would share our desire for power and would also see existence as a competition. And I thought, well, why? Why should that be? My hope would be that the more intelligent any kind of creature or entity is, the less it would be attracted to games of power. But maybe because I'm like a hippie pacifist coward. And I play hockey, so I get into competition. But when it comes to serious competition, like capitalist and political competition, when things can get very serious and maybe people even can die, like your gangsters in Russia, it's like, man, I don't want to be any part of that. So maybe it's my own personality that prevents me from accepting that, no, of course, reality really is the fundamental organizing principle of existence is competition and jockeying for power.
I think, I mean, you've said this before when we talked about your previous book, Mind Body Problems, that you've drifted towards a more open-ended kind of conclusion, or a lack of a conclusion about what the story is, what the fundamental nature of reality is. And I'm uh, in that space myself. What you just said about um, the games, the power games, and whether life is a power game, is directly connected to a conversation I recently had. I've had several dreams lately that included like a simulation theory kind of motif. In one, like I watched a movie, and then at some point the movie bled into reality, and then at some point later the movie officially ended, but you couldn't be sure anymore because you already were for a little while in what you thought was the reality, and then the credits rolled. And so the rest of the dream, I wandered around my hometown with my friends, thinking like, "What the fuck are we supposed to think now? Is this a movie? Is this not a movie? Is there a difference? How does it work?" And then another, I there was some kind of like, I suppose, a computer simulation maybe, or some kind of simulation. So I experienced reality of that dream as a game in the sense of a computer game, like it's not real, and you can be interactive. And there my frustration was that um, I was like at some train station, people were mostly just waiting for the train, and I was like, this is interactive, you can do things, you can talk to people, you can come up with something to do. It's not, what a dumb way to spend time in your computer game of just, you're just gonna actually experience the waiting for the train while there are people around that with whom you can interact. And so when I woke up from that dream, I thought I just was in this like liminal space of the dream has ended, but my eyes are still closed and my mind is still in this dreamy kind of way of experiencing the world. And I thought, if this reality turns out to be not necessarily simulation, but an experience that ends, and then you kind of wake up from being what you thought you were, and there's a continuing experience, I bet the argument about what it was is not going to stop. I think if I meet Donald Trump in the afterlife and I ask him, what do you think of that life experience? He'd say, I won. It's a game that I've been winning throughout my whole time there. There were some setbacks here and there, but basically I won the whole thing. I became the president of the biggest economy in the world, and the whole thing I won. And then if I said to him, I don't think that's the thing you were supposed to win. I don't think that's the point of the game. It wasn't a competition. Here's what I think I experienced, or what my interpretation of that. He would just say, because you're a loser, and move on to try to win in the afterlife.
Right.
And so I don't know if I think this is kind of my, I don't have an articulated metaphysics, but one of the notions that is staying with me is everybody is a version of reality. Like my reality is different from yours, and ours have more in common maybe with that of Donald Trump. But then, a wolf has an even different reality, and this dog that lays next to my feet has a different world, and a mouse that tries to run away from the dog has a different reality. And you can say competition, or you can say a search for a verb, but there are different versions, and what it's going to become in the end is not clear. And you can do different kinds of things with that preset. You can compete, you can destroy a reality of a person, or even people's, or a culture, by destroying the hosts of that reality. And that would be, one way to make your reality more prominent, more pronounced, and less longer than that which you destroyed. But you can also do synthesis, either through, the old-fashioned biological way. You take two humans of different sex, and you make a new human, and the reality of that human will be a product of a merging of the reality of these two other ones. Or you can have a conversation and change the reality of the two participants because of the conversation. Or two countries can merge, so forth. You can invent AI that will have its own version of reality, and what that is going to be depends on who builds the AI and what principles are put in its place. So I don't I don't have the one fundamental principle that I latch on to, whether it's power or beauty or meaning or something, but I think those are all present. And
Novelty. So Terence
novelty,
McKenna,
right?
the psychedelic philosopher, his principle was novelty, and so then that would, and what's the point of novelty? It would come down to a sort of aesthetic delight. He wanted the universe to surprise us, which means that it's open-ended. As far as the power game right now, that's so old. I sort of feel like we've done that. Maybe it's necessary for a certain degree of social functioning and order, but what we're undergoing right now in your country and in my country and across the world, there's this phenomenon of the strongman,
Right.
turning out to be, old-fashioned strongmen turning out to be very attractive leaders. So what the hell? It seems almost medieval, or certainly, like, it obviously evokes the Nazis and Hitler and people like that. So I'm hoping this is just temporary, and we're going to evolve into something much more interesting. But maybe that's really naive on my part. Maybe the sort of progressive liberal order, maybe that will turn out to be sort of this passing fad or fantasy.
I wonder if this connects to my also recent thinking about this kind of thing. Like, so in Russia, if you become visible, if you become prominent, you have to start thinking about the risks, whether the system that's around you is not going to like that thing that you're, that becomes prominent. And my thinking about that has moved towards over the last, I don't know, 5 years. There was a time when I was very active politically. I went to protests. I volunteered at a oppositional campaign. I would pass around these newspapers and stuff. I did different kinds of volunteer work, strictly political, and I'm not doing that anymore. And I'm not exactly sure why, really. But one of the things that in trying to figure out my approach now, what I'm trying to do, what I want to try to do, what I don't want to try to do, I realized that politics is not the only way to make a difference. And it's actually not the way that is most natural to me. And so when you talk about power, if we define power as, let's say, influence on the surroundings, Putin has a certain kind of influence, and then let's say Pelevin, who's a very popular writer, has a different kind of influence, and both influence what Russia is, the ideas about Russia, and the way Russians think about Russia. And you can sort of see a competition even between, let's say, a political leader and a writer. And the competition is not direct. They may not even speak about one another at all. But if the writer writes a book that changes the culture of the country with which the political leader then has to interact, then that's one of the, I suppose that's one way that I see this that one way to see the competition of these different versions of reality that's more natural to me. It's not so much, you know, a direct conflict whether I'm going to be able to, if we start a fist fight, who's going to win. It's more like whether my world and my reality and my way of talking about things will end up encompassing yours or the other way around, or will they exist on equal basis?
Yeah.
And so if you, and I think it's a big part of politics. If you create, you know, like Trump has to be thinking about this kind of thing too. If he creates an environment in which whatever other people do, whatever other people say, it feeds his narrative. You know, you can protest this way or protest that way, and then he'll be able to, you know, if he sets the game up in such a way that whatever you do to try to combat him, he's going to get on top. Sort of like what you said with capitalism. Capitalism has this way of incorporating the critique of capitalism into capitalism itself. And then there was a tweet that I shared with you. Somebody took a screenshot of in Washington Post, I think they wrote an article, something like capitalism not working anymore, we need something new, but it's paywalled, so you need to pay them to get this critique of capitalism.
Yeah.
Right. So in this sense, capitalism is a very powerful system because it has a way of encompassing even the critique of capitalism or a fight against capitalism and turning that into a commodity.
And, you know, and Trump's currency is attention,
right?
And which includes, you know, I think he would prefer that everybody revere him, but I think he's happy with his critics bashing him as long as it still puts him on the front page of the New York Times and
right
as a story on CNN, and you know, and that's kind of related to, if Terrence McKenna were alive today, I think he would say, well, sure, yeah, Donald Trump. I mean, of course, in the same way that Hitler had to be invented because it made history so interesting, so history has produced this bizarre phenomenon of Donald Trump because he sort of stirs the pot. It's a kind of nihilistic way of looking at existence, but I don't know, maybe that's the cosmic divine perspective that's actually accurate, as opposed to, you know, we would like to think we're making moral progress towards some kind of goal. I just somewhere read, somebody quoted William James, and then I lost it. I lost the quote and I haven't been able to retrace it. But the quote was something along the lines of, you know, all this effort that goes into being human, and both on an individual level and on a global level, societal level, you know, we're striving towards something all the time. And what's it for? And James was sort of saying, is it going to make any difference? All our efforts, you know, there is this moral component. Are we moving towards something, or is it more like, I don't know, Hinduism, where it's just endless eternal cycles? And there's the idea of progress is absurd. You know, it's this very recent idea that's traceable to the Enlightenment and to Darwinian evolution. And if you take the further perspective, maybe from the multiverse, you realize how absurd it is to think that there actually can be progress. But I think that is the question. What, you know, if there is progress, toward what? And is there an endpoint, or is the progress forever? At some point, will our moral progress be so complete that we have to invent other games for ourselves? Maybe then we revert to just brutal competitions, just to make existence more dramatic. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think those are questions are supposed to be answered.
Yeah, I wish I could. If anybody knows, if anybody is watching this, all the legions of people watching
Uh-huh.
this, if anybody knows what this William James quote is, I would appreciate them like posting it in comments or letting me know. Nikita, I have to go. I've got to interview some more people from my school. We're trying to promote ourselves to prospective students.
Oh,
So
that's good.
I'm interviewing faculty at Stevens. Not going to be quite. We're not going to be talking about the things that you and I have talked about, unfortunately.
Maybe you can sneak, one or two questions in.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to avoid politics these days. That's for sure.
That's interesting. Yeah, and it might be, from my perspective, a consequence of avoiding politics for a little too long. There was this, like, you don't bring up politics and religion at a dinner party, and I always felt like if you can't, that's a problem. If you know that politics is something that can be discussed, in a way that doesn't spoil everybody's night, then you need to address that issue. That's a problem that needs to be figured out. If you don't, you're gonna end up addressing it eventually in a different way.
Right, but I'm certainly burned out on talking about Donald Trump. It is hard to avoid. But, my God, that's why I'm trying to. I'm in this project. I think about. I'm reading books like this. This is a book on quantum mechanics by a great physicist named John Bell, and in a way, that's kind of my retreat from the chaos of the world.
Yeah, well, let me know if you find out what the fundamental nature of reality is through those books, and whether they has some connection to Donald Trump and all of this stuff.
Absolutely, man.
All
and then we'll
right.
talk about it here on Meaning of Life TV or Mind Body Problems, wherever this
Right.
is going to.
Right. We're blogging heads. That's I don't know where it's going to go. We'll figure it out. But good talking to you as always.
Same here.
All right. Good luck with the interviews and quantum physics.
Okay, thanks.
All right.